Call to the cloud. Okay, good evening. Let's try that again. This is the third and final session in the third series of Big Jewish Ideas, having covered monotheism 2 weeks ago and Shabbos last week. Our big Jewish idea for this week is Tzedakah. Widely translated to charity, but I think we're going to discover that's not a very good translation. So as before, I will produce this text, and I have circulated it, but I'm going to display it on the screen anyway. Let me just get it on the screen. And now everything's working properly again. Here we go. Very nice. So I hope you can all see the text. I'll make it fill the screen. And I'm going to get my little dot out. Right. So the word tzedakah requires a proper analysis. It is clearly, even for those with a modern vocabulary of Hebrew, related to the word tzedek, which means righteousness. A tzaddik is a righteous man. Tzedek means righteousness. And that immediately, if we use this word, if this word is being used correctly, tzedakah puts it at odds with charity. The concept of charity, which, as far as I can see, probably is a Christian conceptualization of how one person helps another, is very much giving someone a handout. It's giving someone one feels sorry for them and one tries to alleviate some of their suffering or poverty by providing with money. That's what the word charity means. That it expresses its early language origins. But here the word said it means righteousness. Righteousness or right does not equate to charity. The concept of charity appears to be something which you elect to do. You don't have to, but you feel sorry for the person, and so you provide them with some money or resources to alleviate their current situation. Righteousness carries a completely different idea that somehow there's a wrong that must be righted, and it's a very different concept. With that kind of introduction in mind, let us look at some verses where this appears. So in the middle of Vayikra, Parshas Kedoshim, Lo sa'asu ovel b'mishpot. You shall do nothing twisted or distorted in judgment, meaning you must have honest courts and not have a corrupt judgment system, justice system. Lo sisof and dol, these are examples. You should not show favor to the poor. V'lo sedar panei godoil, nor honor the face of the great. That means someone who is important. So two examples of not having a corrupt justice system are favoring the poor and favoring the important. Meaning you might favor the important because you like to kind of, be thought well of, or you're concerned about what they might do to you. So perhaps you distort the judgment in favor of the important. But it's also not permissible to show favor to the poor, because there's always an opportunity to try to assist people. But when it comes to a judgment, a law, a din, it's irrelevant who they are, poor, rich, important, unknown. What matters is what's right in din when a case comes before the dayan. Why is that the case? Because b'tzedek tishpoit amisecho, you shall judge your people in righteousness. So the word tzedek makes an appearance here. It means something which is right and correct and just. And when it comes to a court case, a dispute about money, a boundary dispute, whatever it might be, it's utterly irrelevant whether the parties to this dispute are rich, poor, famous, unknown. What matters is the din. That's what tzedek means, something which is right. And righteousness, I think, is a good translation here. But this word actually appears earlier in the Torah as well, in the non-legal portions, in the narratives in Bereshit. And we're going to see two examples here in the life of Avraham. So, Vayotze osa chutza, and God brought him outside. This is when he is currently childless and he's wondering about his future. Vayom, and he said to him, Habet no hashomaymo, please gaze heavenward, usfara kochovim, and count the stars, into chalis barosom, if you can count them. Vayom oloi, and he said to him, God, there's another speech. We see him standing there. And then in a new speech, God says to him, Koye zarecho, that shall be your descendants. That ultimately your descendants will be uncountable. Next verse, Vehemin ba'Hashem, and he believed in God. Despite the fact he was old and had no children, he believed that God would sort this out by some means. And he reckoned, that's Avram reckoned this promise to God as a tzedakah. Now, you could, of course, in context, have read that as an act of charity, but it doesn't mean that. It means that it was right. That's correct, that's how it should be. He reckoned that God had committed to something righteous and something correct by this. Now, there are many other examples that one could use, but I want to pick one more from Bereshis. Now, to get a clear understanding of what this word means. Kiyudativ, and this is God speaking of Avram, for I have known him, Leman, in order, I know him, he's a person to whom I can command his children, his household, after him, and they will preserve his legacy. And what does that mean? What is the legacy of Avram? Why is it that God's going to give this blessing to Avram for his descendants? Because I see something in Avram, he will produce children who will preserve and observe the way of the Lord. La'asod tzedakah. What does that mean? To do tzedakah, to act deeds of righteousness, umishpot and justice, in order that the Lord will bring upon Avram what he had spoken to him, meaning the blessings that he mentioned before. So clearly, tzedakah means to behave rightly, with righteousness. Tzedakah or mishpot are phrases that go together, and we've already seen that. If you go back to the top of the page, we've seen the word mishpot, meaning justice, or more correctly executed law, and tzedek, and tishpot. These words all go together. And you can see that if the word tzedakah is correctly used for giving money to people, for want of a better word, charity is the wrong translation. It conveys the wrong concept. These are not acts of charity. These are acts of righteousness, of rectifying a wrong, of justice. And of course, the most obvious of all examples is a posuk in the middle of Devorim, which is very famous and widely used in a non-Jewish context as well, adorning courts and places of justice around the world. Tzedek, tzedek tirdoif, justice or righteousness, perhaps more correctly. Righteousness, tirdoif, you shall pursue. And why? Why is it so important to pursue righteousness? L'man tichye v'yorashto esoret, in order that you shall live and you shall inherit the land that the Lord your God is giving to you. So living in the land and to thrive in the land is contingent on tzedek tirdoif, on creating a society that is predicated on justice. And the double meaning, there's lots of explanations why the word appears twice. You must pursue righteousness, double righteousness, super righteousness, pursue it repeatedly, whatever meaning, but and even if it's poetic, the emphasis is very strong. And it's written here as a condition of living in the land. So whatever tzedakah, and various forms mean, making sure your society is characterized by this concept will be a prerequisite for living in the land. If you do not act with tzedek, you won't make it in the land. That's not going to happen. It's not going to work. So that's all by way of introduction to try to begin to understand what the word means. Now, I've got a section here what I call Talmudic stories. There are actually, I'm trying to think how many I've got two. I've got two stories here. So inevitably, as always, the Hebrew and English have managed to split. But let's read this one here. This is a very brief one. Both the Gemaras in the tractate Shabbos, quite near the end. In Shabbos 139a, Omar Ula said, and he's a fairly late Amora, so we're talking about the 4th and 5th century. Ein Yerushalayim niftes tzedakah. So we're in the exilic period, where a few hundred years post the destruction of the temple, but the notion of restoration, rebuild land with political and religious autonomy is uppermost in the mind of the rabbis, as is evident from their language, is evident from their prayers, and it's evident from the legal system that they bequeath us, which operates now but is focused on the future. Yerushalayim, Jerusalem, only be redeemed through tzedakah, through righteousness. And we're not using it in the context or giving money to people, or whatever exactly, or resources to people, but it's impossible that they do not hold the same underlying idea. Shenema, how do we know this? And when you make a statement of this sort, an Amora will cite a verse. Shenema, as the verse says, Tzion b'mishpat tipoder, v'shover bitzdokah. Tzion will be redeemed with justice, and those who return to her in righteousness. So once again, notice that mishpat, which is judgment, justice, and righteousness go together. They are twin concepts that appear together throughout Tanakh. And therefore, whatever tzedakah is, it's associated with mishpat, something which is right in some sense of a din, which of course is completely separate from the notion of charity. And actually, this verse is well known because it is the last verse of the Haftorah for Shabbos Chazoin, the Shabbos that precedes Tisha B'Av, which is familiar to me because it's the custom in shuls that the rabbi always has this Haftorah. And in the end, what is the instrument that will result in redemption? This is a messianic prophecy. It is justice and righteousness. It's tzedakah. Now, a slightly longer story, which I'm going to read mostly in the English on the next page, again, illustrating this concept. And it starts like this, and from that which transpired to Shmuel, because I've taken the Safaria translation, which is open access online, but also because it's actually coming in the middle. The story is used to demonstrate a principle which is shown through something that transpired to Shmuel. One can also conclude there is no constellation for the Jewish people, meaning we are not subject to mazal. The text actually, let's go back for a moment and see the actual Aramaic translation. So it doesn't actually state it here because it's a proof text of a previous passage. So I'm going to forgive me. I'm just going to go back now to here. That here's a story, no constellation with the Jewish people. It means we're not subject to random astrological forces. And the Gemara relates that Shmuel and the Gentile sage Ablet were sitting, and they saw these people who were going to the lake. Ablet said to Shmuel, this person will go and he will not return. He pointed to a particular person, this non-Jewish sage, and he pointed to a person and said he will not return because a snake will bite him and he will die. Shmuel said to him, if he's a Jew, he will go and come back. As they were sitting for a while, the person they discussed went away and then returned. So Ablet appears to have got this wrong because the guy has gone off to the lake and he's come back and he is alive. Kom Avlet Shadi Latune. Avlet arose and he threw down the man's backpack. Ashkoch Bechivia Tifsik. He saw there a snake that was cut in two. Ushte Batarati Gube, and it had fallen into two pieces. Omalei Shmuel. Shmuel said to him, this man, I'm presuming he was Jewish, because this is basically an illustration that Jews are not subject to forces of the constellations, to astrological predetermination. Ma avamto, what did you do? Shmuel recognizes there was some din of others, as it were, hanging over this person, and yet he survived. And clearly the guy is quite unwitting. There's a poisonous snake in his bag, and he's just the way he's put it down. He just killed the snake. He didn't even know anything about it. So what have you done that this should happen to you? Omele, kol yoma hava minon rifta bahadi adodi valchino. Every day we sit down and we have our sandwiches together. Today, there was one, I suppose perhaps he's a workman. One of the workmen did not have a sandwich. And he was embarrassed. Now, he says here, because he don't have any to give. I'm not really sure what that means. Aminolu, I said to them, we'll go into the English now. I will go and take the bread. When I came to the person who did not have bread, I rendered myself as one who was taking from him, so that he would not be embarrassed, meaning he pretended, I suppose they pooled the sandwiches, but this guy didn't have any to contribute to the pot. And so what this chap did was that he went to this guy and kind of pretended he was taking a sandwich from him, but actually put in his own sandwich to avoid the guy being embarrassed. Right? Or Malay. Shmuel then said to this guy, mitzvah vat, you did a mitzvah. Nefak Shmuel udarash. Shmuel brought out the following verse, as it were, to explain that incident. Tzedakah tatzil mimoves. Tzedakah, it's translated here as charity. I don't like that translation. Acts of righteousness will save one from death. And not just from a harsh or unusual death, but from death itself. So this story is supposed to be an illustration in the context of the Gemara, that even though there was some harsh din against this person, which Shmuel recognized Ablet had correctly identified, there was still the possibility that an act of righteousness would save him from that. And this story is intended to illustrate this. What is the story? He was indeed destined to death. See if it wasn't a snake was found, but actually was dead, which you would never have known about. And it turns out that righteousness saves from death. Okay, this is the story. Now, I think that what one sees from this, from the two parts of the introduction, that tzedakah here means acts of kindness to the poor. You can see here, he got a poor man, the guy had no bread. He avoided him being embarrassed by pretending that he was taking a sandwich from the guy to put into the pot, but in fact he was contributing his own sandwich to avoid the guy being embarrassed. The guy didn't even get a sandwich out of it, yet it's called tzedakah. And not only is it called tzedakah, it saves from death, i.e. has a kind of revolutionary impact on oneself. It is transformational. And it means, as you can see, that the word tzedakah means something which is right. It means correcting a wrong. It means, it would seem, perhaps in more modern terms, rectifying or redressing inequity. It means righteous means, perhaps you might use a more Aristotelian concept of distributive justice. It means that when there are inequities, when there are wrongs, when there are people who don't have, sorting it out, making one's contribution to make it better, avoiding embarrassment, making a contribution to something. But it does not mean charity. It means correcting something which is wrong. It means establishing or maintaining righteousness. Tzedek and tzedakah are the same concept. Now let's see what the Rambam does with this. Is probably the most famous passage that has ever been written in a Jewish text on the theme of tzedakah. And it's in the 10th chapter of Hilchos Matnas Aniyim, the Rambam's laws of giving to the poor. And he sets out what are normally called the 8 stages of tzedakah, which I'm sure you've come across before. I didn't include all of the text because there are a couple of passages which were quite long. It didn't really outline the various stages of what tzedakah actually is. So I'm going to read this now, just to give you some sense of how long it is. All of this is still part of the same text, and it's going to take us through here to the middle of the 4th and final page. I will read some of it in Hebrew and some of it in English, but you'll see where I've missed bits out because the numbers, the paragraph numbers will change. So he makes a few general observations. We must be especially careful to observe the mitzvah of tzedakah, more so than any other positive mitzvah. For tzedakah is a sign of the righteous lineage of Avraham. And you can see what the Rambam is doing. He's making out that tzedakah, and tzedakah hereby he means giving resources to people. How you do it, and with what intention you do it, is still to come. But tzedakah, the Rambam is now using in the way we use it, which means to give money to people in some way. Right? Because tzedakah is a similar tzaddik, Zera Avram Avinu, is the sign or an indicator of, as it were, of the righteousness of the descendants of Avram. It's a peculiar contribution. It's a big Jewish idea, if you like. It is bequeathed to the Zera Avram Avinu, to the descendants of Avram. This is not to say there aren't extremely generous people in the non-Jewish world, but the concept that Judaism provides about tzedakah is unique, and this is a unique Jewish idea. So, this is a verse we saw quote already. I've singled him out. I've made him known, but it means Yidativ means I've identified him. The Rambam's made sense of the verse we saw earlier. I've identified him so that I will command his descent. I mean, there is something about Avram which he fits the criteria for creating a people whose society will be characterized, lasso tzedakah, to perform tzedakah in a very big sense, meaning it will be characterized by righteousness. And literally means the throne of Israel is not established and truth is not set up, except through tzedakah, as the verse says in Yeshaya, tzedakah tikoinoni, right? You shall be established, or I will establish you through tzedakah, meaning that God enters the world through this means, because God, as we assume, treats human beings equally, sees them equally, and creating a world permeated by this, he's bringing godliness into the world. And indeed, ve'ein Yisrael nigolim ela b'tzedakah, the Jewish people are only redeemed, and that's a direct citation of the Gemara we saw on the previous page of Ulla, and he quotes the same verse. The translation is not the same. I'm reliant on the translations that are available. And he carries on. Before he gets to tell you about how to do it, a bit more to say. La'olam ein odom ma'ami minat tzedakah. No one ever gets poor from tzedakah, meaning, counterintuitively, you do not become impoverished by giving your money away. Ve'ein dover lo hezek niglal b'shvil hatzedakah. Nothing bad has ever come from it, and nothing ever comes out of tzedakah that is negative. Shenema, and he quotes various verses, and I'm now going to move into the English for a bit, because it's a bit much to read and translate. Anyone who shows compassion, others will show compassion to him, as it is said, may God show you compassion, and let your compassion increase. Here the compassion itself increases, and if someone is cruel and without compassion, then it is suspect. For cruelty is only found among the idolatrous nations, meaning it's suspicious maybe the person is not actually Jewish anyway. So it talks a little bit about a more particularist approach, that we have a certain responsibility within our own community. But the point he's making is there is something existential. Remember, we saw the verse, Tzedakah tatsil mimoves. Tzedakah saves a person from death. There is something which is existential, almost metaphysical, about setting the world to right through tzedakah, which, as it were, enables or reflects a core part of the divine project for humanity. That is what tzedakah is about. And the Rambam clearly sees it in these terms, and he hasn't finished yet. Anyone who averts his eyes from the need of tzedakah, meaning where there's a need, is called biliyal. Biliyal is a word you can see here. It has a cognate in English as well. It means you've got nothing to you, just empty. And he quotes various verses which support this. And such a person is called wicked. As what's the example? Scoundrels among you have subverted the eyes of the needs of tzedakah. Tzedakah doesn't necessarily mean just giving money. It means acting in a righteous way to create a just society. And that means that there's a much larger concept of tzedakah than simply giving people in need money. It means correcting society. It means ironing out inequities. It means what you might call distributive justice, which might not be exactly the right phrase, but it brings the idea that by distributing resources in a different way from how they are currently aligned, one creates a greater justice in the world. And of course, that can be done in many ways, one of which is distributing funds, but it depends how you do it. So let's skip the rest of this paragraph and move to the Rambam's more famous, but I've missed out a few paragraphs, as I said I would, and we're now on section Zion 7 here. Now, Shemona ma'alos yesh b'tzedakah zoy l'mala mizoy. There are 8 levels of tzedakah, each one greater than the other. Mala gedola shein l'mala mimeno. What's the greatest of all, above which there is no greater? And it's very interesting. Whenever this Rambam is quoted, it's always quoted the other way around. You start at the lowest level, and you get eventually to this level, level 8. But the Rambam doesn't present it like that, because he regards all the others as b'di'eved, meaning suboptimal. Maybe you have to do it. He starts off saying, this is what you should be doing. This is how to do tzedakah. If you can't do this, then go to the next level. If you can't do that, go to the next level. But he never expresses it as it's commonly quoted, by starting with the lowest level and ascending to the higher level. He starts at the higher level. And that indicates what we've said already, which is the concept of tzedakah is much larger than simply giving money to people who ask for money. It's about improving society, rectifying society, and responding to inequity in society. Tzedakah and mishpat are closely related, as we've seen in the verses. So here we go. What's the first one? The level about which there is no other. Ze hamachzik b'yad Yisrael shemach v'noisen lo matona or halva or ise imo shetofus or mamsi lo malocha kedei lechazek es yodoi or shelo yitzarech labrias lishoel. Easy to read the English. It's higher than all the S. It's to fortify a fellow Jew. He's talking about within Jewish society, but how these concepts apply by Jews to the outside world is an important topic, but it's not what we're immediately discussing. The concept of tzedakah in this context is talking about within the Jewish community, although there's certainly a concept beyond it. What do? You strengthen the hand of a Jew by giving him a gift or a loan or going into partnership with him or finding work for him in order to strengthen his hand so as such that he will no longer need to ask people for assistance. Well, Zen he quotes a verse, this is quite a radical reformulation of the concept of tzedakah, which has no exact precedent. And he quotes a verse here: if your kinsman, being in straits, comes under your authority and you hold him as though a resident alien, let him live by your side. As it says, meaning the person will live with you. Not that you will give him money to go away, meaning you'll find a way in which it's possible for the person to coexist with you, i.e. you will form a partnership with them in some way or other, such that he will not fall further and be in need. And the Rambam feels confident that he has identified here the optimum way of giving tzedakah, if that's quite the right way. But once we've cast it in this larger, we can understand. This is to take someone who is in need and to help them find the means to, through a gift or a loan or a partnership or finding him a job so that he can be self-sufficient, meaning he can move from a needy person to be an active, contributing member of society, and to avoid embarrassment and to avoid the possibility of ongoing, if you like, ongoing need, but also to create autonomy and independence, which for most people who are in dire poverty might be the most important thing they lack, because that robs them of their dignity. Because the tzedakah concept is not just about giving them money so they have money, but doing it in a way that enables them to be self-sufficient, not a drain on society, not feeling undermined, and also that they can gain autonomy and join, as it were, the ranks of society as they are entitled to. So you can see why this is the top level of tzedakah according to the Rambam, because it fits all those criteria. And so it carries on. Pachos mizer. What's the next level down? So this is level, we can call it level 2. This is when you give money to the poor, but you do not know to whom you are giving the money, nor does the recipient know from whom it came. Why? Because when you neither know who the other is, the whole thing is done lishma, meaning just for purely altruistic sake, which means that it minimizes the embarrassment, because there's obviously has to be an intermediary. And he explains this is purely meant for its own sake, such as the chamber of secrets in the holy temple, for there the righteous will give in secret and leave the poor of Gurban. This is called matan basesa, meaning there will be a way of giving money in the temple, and it will be deposited. You'd go in there, perhaps when no one was there, leave the money, no one saw you leaving it, and then someone else will take the money, and no one ever knows exactly who's giving to whom. Very close to this, and now we're going down to level 3, is one who gives of tzedakah, meaning the word kuppah is used in modern Hebrew. It literally means a box, but a kuppah is a kind of is a contribution that one makes to some kind of health insurance system. So you're probably familiar with kupat cholim. In Israel, which literally means the box of the sick, but it means contributions that are made to enable people to pay for their medical care. So the kuppah means, therefore, it's a kind of communal fund. But one should not contribute to the kuppah of tzedakah unless one is certain the one who counts is trustworthy. That's a side issue, meaning that obviously if you're going to arrange someone to be an intermediary and you decide to contribute to some kind of organization, which will then distribute the money, it will be very sensible to check that they are reliable, that they're going to give the money as you intend. One level lower is one who gives tzedakah, and the giver knows to whom he gives, but the poor person does not know from whom it takes. Such are the great sages who will go in secret and throw money onto the doorways of the poor. And there are many stories, even in much more recent times, of people who go out late at night putting envelopes through doors and so on. A method such as this is what is a good way when the keepers of tzedakah do not behave competently, meaning if you can't trust the gaboyim, the people who are responsible for overseeing these matters, and you're worried the money will be stolen or not given to the right people, then this is an option. So you give it yourself, which means you're certain that it ends up on the right doorstep. Pochos mizeh, the last paragraph in the Rambam, I'm going to go back to the English. One level low is when the poor person knows from whom he takes, but the giver does not know to whom he gives, such as the way of sages who would tie coins to their garments and would throw the bundle over their shoulder, so the poor could come and take from behind them without being embarrassed. One level low is to give to him with one's own hand before he can ask. Meaning you do give it directly to the poor person, but before he has to embarrass himself, demean himself by asking. One level lower is to give him after he has asked. One level lower is to give him less than one should, but with kindness. And one level lower is to give begrudgingly. Be'etzem, miserably, it really means like, oh, right, reluctantly, with misery, and so on. So, as I said, it's a long time since I looked at this text prior to preparing the shir last week. And what really excited me was to see the order in which the Rambam did it, which I completely forgotten or never knew, that he doesn't start at the bottom and go to the top, as I said, as most presentations do. What this indicates is the concept of tzedakah, of which giving money to people is just one, is very broad. It's very, very broad. And this little passage, which is the final source on our sheet, is an excerpt from the writings of Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch to Bereshis 15:6, but just to remind you, probably best before we read it, to go back to the verse, because we actually had this verse. This is 15:6. Remember, it's the second source. That God brought Avram outside and he contemplated the stars, and God said, you won't be able to count them. This is how many your descendants will be. And then finally, the verse here, 6, Ve'ha'amin b'Hashem, he believed in God. And he reckoned it to him for righteousness. What does that mean? That's the verse that Rav Hirsch is commenting on in our very last source, to which I'm now going to scroll again. Here we go. So, tzedakah from the Ruth, tzedek is something else. Now, I cut it off. I've already banged on about how charity, which is a wonderful thing, is a concept that comes from a different culture, and the word charity conveys that idea. And Rav Hirsch mentions what charity is, and then he says the word tzedakah, which comes from the word tzedek, right, is something else, i.e. it's not the same idea as charity. As we've already noted, tzedek is phonetically related to the Aramaic shin dalet ha, to soothe, satisfy, sustain. In other words, to give the other person what he needs, to be good to him, to seek his welfare and well-being. Tzedek rectifies the world and promotes the happiness of the individual and the community. Through the attribute of tzedek, every creature will have the benefit of the conditions intended for it by divine design. For me, this really is the key line. Tzedek, of which tzedakah is one, if you like, subcategory. It means every creature will have the benefit of the conditions intended for it by the divine design, meaning that people lack certain core opportunities. There is an inequity in the world. There is unfairness. And tzedek means righteousness, and it goes with mishpat, which means something which is legally correct. It's about intervening in whatever way is appropriate to ensure that everything in the world is able to act and perform its duties and to have a fair crack of the whip, if you like. Tzedek is the goal of God's direction of the world. From man's point of view, tzedek is the ideal. Any divine or human act that brings the individual or the community near to this goal is tzedakah. And therefore, tzedakah, as I've said already, has a brave, I was pleased to find this actually when I'd written most of the shir already, that tzedakah has this very broad concept and meaning, and clearly giving what we call tzedakah in the narrow sense is only an act of true tzedek if it brings the individual or the community nearer to this goal, the goal that people have their opportunities, they have the conditions in which to live a meaningful spiritual and physical life. As you can see, that's why the Rambam setting up a person to enable them to act autonomously, to be able to make their own living, to have the independence and the dignity which is the right of every human being. That is why for the Rambam, the highest level of tzedakah is enabling a person to become financially independent through a loan or a gift or a partnership. Any divine or human act that brings the individual community near to this goal is tzedakah. Tzedakah is required for tzedakah, and tzedek leads to tzedakah, meaning in order for something to be tzedakah, it must be based in tzedek. And of course, tzedakah properly practiced leads to tzedek, which means to improve the conditions of every creature in the world. When God acts with tzedakah towards his creatures, he acts benevolently toward them. When man acts with tzedakah toward his fellow man, he acts benevolently toward him, but fulfills an obligation to God. For every person is obligated to promote tzedek with all his spiritual and material resources, i.e., tzedek is a project for humanity in which every human being is required to think about the resources they have and how they are using them for the betterment of the community and of the world. The whole reason he has given these resources is to establish tzedek in the world around him. Every contribution to the establishment of tzedek is tzedakah. Tzedakah then is a whole life of faithfulness to duty. Mishpat is only the negative side, shunning evil. I mean, when we say mishpat, it means dealing with wrongdoing. But tzedakah is active promotion of the plan of God for every human being, whereas tzedakah is the positive realization of the good. So I like that piece, and it kind of tops, is kind of, as it were, tops out the share very nicely. And I'm pleased that I came to ideas which are very similar to Rav Hirsch through my own research and understanding of the word. So with that, I'm actually going to stop the screen share. I have completed the ideas, and if you have any questions on this, this is the moment. You will have to unmute yourself if you wish to speak. Well, I'll take that either there are no questions or no one's awake. Well, we are awake. I know you're awake. I'm not entirely sure. So anyway, it's very nice to see everyone. And I don't know, it could well be this idea was kind of rather self-evident or obvious, but I think that I put it what's a bigger concept, but I think that the most important thing is the concept of tzedakah does not translate into charity. It's just the wrong idea. Charity is a wonderful thing, but it's not this. This is a different concept. It's like
the I don't know where it comes from, maybe a Christian kind of, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach him how to fish, and he can live. I
was thinking of that. I mean, it was used to be an old Chinese proverb, but that just means you don't know where it comes from. But you're right; it is similar. That it's one thing to give someone, but to enable them to kind of be autonomous will be the object, and that fits. Actually, I was thinking that.
Exactly,
I read the Rambam. It fits very strongly. You're right into the Rambam's highest category. And of course, we're not to say that no one else has thought of this idea, but we feel it, we see it in a big of. That's why tzedakah and tzedek, righteousness and right, go together in this way. And I like Rav Hirsch's thing at the end about mishpat, meaning you have to have mishpat, you have to have a justice system to make sure that people don't do bad things. But it's not good enough just not to do bad things. You have to. That's why it would never say mishpat tiradov. You can't pursue mishpat because mishpat is prevented. Where tzedek is the positive to take active steps as a core feature of Jewish life to rectify inequity and to use one's resources for the betterment of people's lives and the world.
Amen.
Can I ask? Oh, sorry.
Sure. No, I think that's Stuart.
There are actually. Can I ask a question?
Yeah, but Kelly, you're second in line. Stuart's asking first.
Second in line. Perfect.
Stuart.
No problem.
I was just going to ask how Matanot Le'Evyonim fits in. So I noticed the passage of the Rambam we were quoting was from his laws of gifts to the poor. Is that a synonym for tzedakah, or is one a subset of the other? Does it have a separate root?
So I think that it's a subset. This whole tzedakah idea of giving is a subset of his general category of tzedek, and I think that Hirsch reflects the Rambam's worldview very well with this. And he has a recognition that there are very poor people, and the question is what to do. And but the difficulty with that, of course, is that people do loan people money. How do you take pledges? There's lots of details which need to be unpicked, and also. there's a recognition that if we don't have some way when people loan money to recover the loans, no one will loan money in the first place. And so you end up what's called shalom ninol deles bifnei loivim, not to shut the door in the face of potential borrowers. And so he recognizes there are kind of realities around this, and sometimes loans are not tzedek so much, but someone's got a business enterprise, a person wants to invest in a business. This is more around the line of what to do is how to rectify inequities. But yes, I mean, the Torah is practice itself. They will always be those people impoverished in the world. It's a question of how we respond to them. So he does have to have a whole section dealing with gifts of the poor. Some of them, of course, are talking about very specific formalized gifts, like leaving the gleanings in the field, leaving not picking up a sheaf that's been forgotten, leaving the corners. That will all fit into that as well. But nonetheless, I think he does expect us to see the notion of giving within the larger framework of not just giving handouts, but attempting to improve the world and the lot of the recipient, rather than just getting rid of them or rectifying a problem temporarily. Kelly, I think.
Yeah, actually, I can see that
we can't see you. Because
summarize it. It's very difficult. It's, as you say, it's very broad subject. And you summarize very well in 3 directions, if I'm right. Just to say, in Hebrew we start with the idiom say, tzedek tirdof. Tzedek ze lo kochav lechet. What that means that
you'll need to translate, please.
First of all, the court that need to judge in honestly, in tzedek. The second term is tzedek, that means you have to be tzedek, help the weak against the wicked. And the third one is actually giving money to the poor people in a different way. And the final one, as we learn about the slave, the Jewish slave, after 7 years, you have to give him at least 10% from all the years so he cannot sell himself again to a slave.
Yeah, Rav Hirsch talks about this point, about how the whole slave, and slave is not a very good translation, because here the person is rehabilitation to prevent the person from becoming needy, and so on. He does talk about these ideas in the context of Mishpotim and other places, where this idea of a Jewish indentured servant who effectively, to avoid destitution, someone partners with them in order to enable them to kind of be, to be retrained effectively, and to enable them to rejoin society. So there's a lot to say about this. So thank you very much for your contributions, and I've enjoyed this season. We're preparing a program with some guest speakers and a Shabbaton, and there's lots of stuff for January and February. There will be another series of big Jewish ideas, but it may be a little while. We'll quite a lot of stuff in the next couple of months. Next Tuesday's special treat is the second shir with Rami, which I think is at 8 o'clock on Tuesday, and it's on the Parsha, and I think it's going to be good. We'll be discussing it. I'm certainly planning to come.
Thank you. Looking forward.
Okay. Bye-bye, everyone. Good evening. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you.